drowning on dry land.
The 7th episode, parts 13 and 14. Part 13, fruitcake, anyone? By the time I woke to the morning light, something had changed. Because one mystery was now solved. I had broken apart, fallen as far down as I could go, and begun a climb back. A social worker arrived to wake us and take our vitals. I remember touching my face and wondering why I didn't yet have a beard. Hadn't the better part of a week passed? I was stunned when I looked in the mirror and saw that the whiskers on my cheeks and chin had barely grown. And here I thought I'd be ready to join a ZZ Top tribute band. As before, time had become so elastic that it hadn't been a week at all that had passed. It had only been 2 days. This had me sitting in puzzled silence for a while and then getting up to meander about the ward, eventually arriving at the table that was placed by the courtyard window. The same courtyard that had hosted my hallucinations. After some minutes, I felt a wave of emotion come over me and, laying my head on my folded arms, I began to weep. Not with the gentle sobs that had assailed me since my breakdown. This was for everything. For every person I had wounded. For every hurt I had suffered. For the long road of staying alive. It all poured out. And then I felt an arm around my shoulders, and a woman's quiet voice whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, you're gonna be all right." I felt a sudden calm, and I got hold of myself and raised my head. There was no one nearby. Twice before in my life, I encountered what I believe to this day were ghosts or phantoms. In both instances, I ran into a strange woman with riveting eyes and an electric aura, and experienced a jolt of recognition before she disappeared. I don't mean in a puff of smoke or anything like that. She was nowhere in sight. And in both instances, there were no places where they could have hidden. I don't know who or what had come to comfort me that morning, but I heard the words as clearly as I've ever heard anything. A few minutes later, Lauren, one of the other patients, sat down in the next chair and greeted me with a kind smile. She was a modest but pleasant woman in her 30s with a sad and nervous yearning in her eyes. She asked me something I didn't catch. Then Gloria appeared, spoke her name, and waved a hand. She got up and went to sit next to her friend Bethany. As the morning progressed, I began to grasp the setup. The social workers and nurses on the ward were all employees of the facility. The meals and the housekeeping were contracted. Gloria and the other assistants were kind to me. The manager simply bullied patients who wouldn't march to his orders. He seemed to believe that the only way my fellow crazies and I would behave our errant selves was by way of a hard-ass routine. In fact, the patients were a deranged but gentle lot, and the only hint of violence would appear later, in another place, and happen to me. A psychiatrist arrived and took me aside to explain that he would be my doctor throughout. He had a heavy accent and nodded a lot. I asked if he was German and told him that I had served there in a former life. I noted vaguely, but everything was vague, that he didn't like the question. I found out later that he was from the Middle East and had taken umbrage. He asked if I knew what had happened to me. I told him that I knew exactly what had happened. Something had gone wrong in my head. I had undergone a lobotomy that erased most of my brain and had then died. He asked why I thought I'd been lobotomized, and I told him because I was there. They put the wires on me. I heard that machine humming. He didn't correct me. Over the weeks that followed, he would visit about every other day. I found him another unsympathetic sort, in his case seeming to have written me off as not worth much of his time from the start. Hours of the day were taken up with routines. Every morning and afternoon brought some kind of therapy activity. Sometimes there were discussions and patients were encouraged to speak. I don't recall much about any of them except that they were simple and boring. Usually the leader of the discussion would take one look at my blank face and move on. At times I managed to slip away and one of the social workers would find me pacing the hall or standing at the window looking out at the day. As to our meals, I barely touched anything. This aversion to food went on for the next 3 weeks, and I would end up losing almost 20 pounds, dropping to the lowest I had been since my daughter was a baby. This in spite of Gloria's gentle scoldings. I moved from one place to the next in a fog, attending to my basic needs. I had discarded most of my sense of self as I floated about, oblivious. This was my new path through the hereafter. So the days moved along, with me passing the hours, drifting in and out of the present, between delusion and reality. Somewhere along the line, I started making phone calls from my planet to Earth.
During one call, he asks me if I know where he is. I tell him he's in a psychiatric facility. He tells me the nurse handed him some pills, asks if he should take them. I tell him they're safe. Another time, after we'd visited, he calls to ask if I'd been informed that he has AIDS. I tell him I hadn't, and he says he's been moved to the AIDS wing of the hospital. Neither was true.
There were some comic moments in the midst of all the drama. Once I thought I had proved my non-existence by walking up to the mirror that formed the upper half of the nurse's station, and standing before it, saw only the hallway behind me. I was not reflected. An empty mirror, just like in the book by the same name that I had discovered some 40 years before and revisited time and again ever since. Later, I was amused to discover that it wasn't a mirror at all. I had been peering at the hallway on the other side, which of course was laid out exactly like the one behind me. Another instance upset my daughter. I thought it was funny. At my request, she brought me a box of colored pencils. The security guard said, "Sorry, you can't bring those in. We've got crazy people back there." Angered at this caricature, she wanted to say, "Yes, I know, my father's one of them," and explained that I needed the pencils to create my mad designs. It was no use. The rule was Crayolas and stubby pencils all the way. During that same visit, a social worker took her and Sansony and me to the dining room for a family session. I didn't understand anything they were saying, what with the volume turned down to mute and the blinders on my eyes. So I got up and wandered off to study the art on the walls. The next morning, Gloria stopped to say, "You need to tell your wife to bring you something to wear," and walked away. I froze. Had I been rambling around naked in my no longer sleep late 60s body all this time? Well, then again, if I was invisible, who would notice or care? I went to find Madeline. Keeping my eyes downcast, I whispered the question, "Do I have clothes on?" She was puzzled and said, "Well, no." "Oh my God." "Not clothes. You're still wearing your hospital gown," she went on. "I think it's the same one you had on when you were admitted." The next time Sansony came to visit, I sat with her for a sad 10 minutes and then couldn't bear it any longer. Before she left, Gloria told her I needed something else to wear. And when she showed up again 2 days later, she brought me t-shirts from home and sweats from Target. That much was genuine, and it was becoming a challenge to maintain my grasp on my unreality. And yet, night after night, like some weak soul with a lurid addiction to the streets where the wanton women strolled, I kept returning to my dark depths. It meant that nothing outside my state of being or my past was there anymore, other than in memory. And those memories were painful, so much so that when Sansony, or the specter of her that I could discern through the veil, came to visit, I stopped coming out of my room. She didn't understand that the grief at lingering with her fading presence was too much to bear, and it wounded her. She thought it was anger, but it was only my immense sadness. Since I could still not convince Madeline, or anyone else for that matter, that I was actually dead and just ambling through an afterlife while I waited to be whisked away, I requested that she go look up my webpage so that she could see the testimonials marking my passing. She came back later to tell me that she had seen all my books on the page and was impressed. Wait, no testimonials? I didn't understand. Did no one note my death? You bastards. And I loaned some of you money. My psychiatrist wandered through, continuing his heartless prick routine. He had fixed on my contention that I had been lobotomized and would not let it go, even after I told him I wasn't so sure about it anymore. He also would not consider letting me leave for home. For now, I was staying. But it was not the first time I was in a place I couldn't leave, having spent a night in jail on 3 occasions, and of course my years in the military. The hours went by, and through the fog of my medication, the notion that perhaps I wasn't in fact dead began creeping in. There was more of substance around me. People spoke, and I understood and responded. While it was nice to be able to communicate again, the paradigm shift was puzzling. Could it be that my journey into the unknown, that leap across the river of time and space, had been my brain on some kind of lark? Well, that would certainly change everything. I'm convinced to this day that wherever I had gone, I did catch a glimpse at the other side, though I admit I didn't experience any revelation of the divine, nor an evaporation into the universe. And so the time moved along, with me passing the hours, drifting in and out of the present between truth and fiction. I took one of my trusty crayons and spent an hour writing a message, not in a bottle, but on the wall of the room I shared with Tom. From what I recall, I stated that some wisp of me had been there and had summoned enough material presence to lift my hand and do my thing. The words ran from as high as I could reach to about the level of my knees. It might have been the best thing I've ever written since I began my career as a reporter at the age of 16, but I'll never know because it was all gone the next day. Madeline told me that the cleaning crew had wiped it all away, but in her opinion, it was a screed for the ages. Then she asked me to please not do it again. In the real world, it was my 5th night, and I was dropping off to sleep when I sensed a presence in the room that was not Tom with his pain moans and wet coughs and thrashing about. He was quiet for once. Another body was moving around. Then my blanket was lifted and someone slipped under the covers. I jumped out and pulled back the curtain. In the dim light, I saw Lauren, her head now resting on one of my pillows and looking up at me with her melancholy eyes. I have no idea how she slipped in. I stepped into the hall and called for the night nurse, who came to lead her away, saying, "Lauren, we've talked about this." Lauren didn't resist. I still remember the apologetic smile she offered me as they left. Later, I learned that this was something of a routine with her. The social workers claimed that she wasn't looking for erotic adventures, just a warm body to comfort hers. I was the most recent in her search for some heat in the night. Another morning, I woke to the sound of Tom in the throes of something awful, as if his insides were being ripped out. I went for one of the nurses. Out in the day room, he was sitting with a trash can between his feet, coughing up blood by the cupful. One of the other patients said, "Got the DTs." I was settling into some kind of a comfort zone. It was easy there. The worst of my madness had ebbed. The people around me were not unkind. I wanted to go home and ask Dr. Doolittle every time I saw him, but he was evasive. I was a living madman across the water. But this peace did not last, because I was about to be sent to a different mad world, this one featuring real dangers. And I put myself there. Part 14, Bad Companions. As more days dragged on, feeling like more weeks, I started to come undone. I wanted out of there, and I wasn't going to take no for an answer. It was Thursday night that I decided I'd reached the end of my rope and started ranting. I don't know what set me off, but I cranked it up, going from 0 to 60 in about 10 seconds. Who are these people keeping me trapped? Why wouldn't they send for my wife or my daughter to take me home? I demanded to be let go immediately. The nurses and social workers on duty were startled. I had been no real trouble, at first all but catatonic and then simply sedate. This was something they'd never seen, and as I stomped about, raging, the other patients started acting nervous and then alarmed. When nobody could calm me, they began escorting them one by one down the hallways to their rooms. I was wrecking everybody's evening. My brain was shouting, "Where are they all going?" And when the last patient had disappeared, I started throwing things. At first it was magazines and papers that were lying around. Then I went for bigger stuff, a stapler, then a couple of the chairs. I pushed a keyboard off the nurse's desk at the back of the room and then grabbed the monitor and hefted it over my head on my way of throwing it through the window so I could make my escape that way. That's when I heard the voice of the nurse in charge, quiet but firm. She said, "Thurston, stop." I deflated, letting her take the monitor from my hands. She and another staffer moved me into a chair. I saw 2 male attendants in blue coming my way. I started yelling for help. They kept coming. One held me while the other jabbed a spike into my bicep. Within moments, all my cares were gone, and I graciously allowed them to escort me to my room. The next morning, Friday, it seemed that all had been forgiven. Then around mid-afternoon, patients started disappearing. But now it was out of the building, because they were being collected by family for the weekend or longer. Don was the first to leave, which meant the TV wars had ended. Lauren and Bethany were next. I was pleased that they both had families who cared enough to come get them. Then George left, and finally Tom. By Saturday afternoon, I was the only one left, and I was looking forward to having the place to myself from then on. The remote would be mine alone. Sooner or later, someone would come for me, wouldn't they? In the meantime, I'd be able to roam the halls and watch old movies in peace. This was not how it worked out. I was in fact heading for a dark funhouse, and I would find no peace there. At 6 o'clock, one of the social workers came knocking to tell me to pack my things. Wait, were they sending me home for my misbehaviors of the day before? Why hadn't I thought of that sooner? I readied for my triumphant return to Woodland Avenue. I was not even close. A social worker led me out of the section and down several hallways and delivered me to a ward on the far end of the complex. It was teeming with life. This was Saturday night in the big city after all. Testosterone, physical strength, and brain skewed by poor upbringing and failing schools can be a dangerous mix. Welcome to Section 7. Most of the patients were white and of a particular subclass of nascent hoodlum. I know, stereotyping, but I grew up in a rural, blue-collar Northeast and knew these ridge runners, aka rednecks in the South, down to my bones. They were products of broken families with fathers who were absent even when they were in the house and mothers who could not control them. They were not scholars and they did not play sports. They no longer joined the military. Their dreams consisted mainly of cars with loud exhausts. The social worker told me that most of them were there after run-ins with the law, an alternative to a lockup. The average age was 20, making me the oldest of the 36 or so by decades. But whose brilliant idea was it to put a man in his 60s in with a bunch of miscreants barely out of their teens and with nothing but time on their hands anyway? Curiously enough, I found out on that first night that one of those running the show was a clever queen who went by Aranji. Now, that was not his or her actual name. He or she was in everyone's business and the one who started the whispers about me. Something wasn't right about the newest arrival, and Aranji came up with the answer. I was a spy. Of course. What else would I be doing there? By the next morning, I was being shadowed at every step. Wherever I sat or stood, 3 or 4 of my new friends were close by, eyeballing me and whispering between themselves. I came to understand that this was mostly a result of boredom. There was nothing much to do in there, so why not? That didn't make it something I could ignore. The next afternoon, Talia and Sansony came to see me in the room they set aside for visitations. My daughter was shot. The place fairly reeked of male aggression. I didn't fail to notice her worried look as they were going out the door. I was moved to a different room every night. When I asked why, one of the social workers explained that no one wanted me around. If only they would have gotten to know me. My one small diversion was the yard, a high-walled enclosure of 100 square feet that we were allowed to visit for a half hour after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There, too, I was ostracized, which was fine with me. I didn't give a damn about these guys or their chatter or games anyway. I wanted only to find a spot where I could raise my face to the sun. And for all the mumbling and posturing, they didn't scare me, though things soon turned more ominous. As the days went by, the whispers ramped up and the stares were like blades. I could handle it, but once I caught a glimpse of a cell phone, strictly forbidden, I decided I wasn't going to wait around and see what else they might be hiding, or what kind of hurt they might be dreaming up for me. This sense of danger came and went, some of it paranoia, some of it real. The bullying grew more constant and more annoying, and I was losing my patience. An observant staff might have noticed what was going on and done something about it, but they didn't, and they didn't. Or they did and didn't care. But then came the incident that had me taking matters into my own hands. A small section of the main room had been set aside for presentations, complete with rows of theater seats. No matter which one I took, I was surrounded within a minute by a half-dozen punks. A couple on each side, 2 in the row in front, and more behind me. What exactly they got out of these threatening dances, I never understood. All I knew was that it wasn't going to stop unless I did something about it. It was the end of what had been a rough week. I was sitting in one of the theater seats, minding my own business, waiting for the presentation about getting better, and they began circling like sharks in bloody water or hawks on roadkill. I heard some mutters and saw more cold smiles, their specialty. I could deal with that. But then one of them passed behind and poked me in the back of the head with a hard elbow. That was it. I stood up and started yelling. "Hey, you! What the f*** was that?" And I went from there, getting louder. It worked. My little friends scrambled away like startled rats. 2 attendants appeared to take me in hand and steer me across the room. One of them produced a folding screen, effectively putting me in quarantine. A supervisor stepped up, assessed the situation, and told me to go collect my paper bag of clothes and my toothbrush. Could it be that they'd finally had enough of my antics and were sending me home? No chance of that. Instead, I was escorted down the hallway to a different section, shown to a room, and then taken to what looked like a high school cafeteria. Tall windows on the far wall offered a view of the grounds, the new greens of spring, and the faint downtown skyline far beyond. This would be my new home.